This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The summer of 1922 in Harlan County, Kentucky, was marked by an oppressive heat that seemed to settle into the bones of the land itself. In the remote backwoods, where the Appalachian foothills gave way to dense forests of oak and pine, the Stillwell property stood isolated, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through miles of wilderness. The nearest town, Corbin, lay 14 miles to the northwest, a journey that in those days required most of a day by wagon. It was in this isolated place that Vera Stillwell vanished without a trace on the morning of August 17th, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt the region for decades. The facts, as they were initially recorded, appeared straightforward. Vera Stillwell, age 32, was last seen by her husband Clayton on the evening of August 16th. According to his statement to the county sheriff, she had retired to bed complaining of a headache. When Clayton awoke the following morning, she was gone. Her clothing remained in the wardrobe, her shoes sat by the door. The household money, kept in a tin box in the kitchen, was untouched. It was as though she had simply evaporated into the humid Kentucky air. The Stillwell property consisted of approximately 200 acres of forested land, with a two-story farmhouse built in 1887. The house itself was a structure of weathered wood and stone set back from the dirt road by a quarter-mile. Behind the house stood a barn, a smokehouse, and what locals referred to as the old root cellar, a stone structure partially underground that had been built by the previous owners. The nearest neighbors, the Hendricks family, lived 3 miles to the east along a path that was barely more than a deer trail through the woods. Clayton Stillwell had purchased the property in 1919, shortly after returning from service in France during the Great War. He had married Vera Oakes, a woman from Lexington, in the spring of 1920. According to county records, the couple had no children. Clayton worked the land minimally, earning income primarily through the sale of timber from his extensive acreage. Neighbors described him as a solitary man, tall and lean, with a quiet demeanor that some found unsettling. He rarely attended church services in Corbin, and when he did venture into town, he conducted his business quickly and departed without engaging in the casual conversations that characterized rural social life. Vera, by contrast, had initially made attempts to integrate into the sparse community. Mrs. Cordelia Hendricks, the nearest neighbor, later recalled that in the first year of the Stillwells' residence, Vera would occasionally walk the 3 miles to visit, despite the difficult terrain. She described Vera as a woman of refined bearing, perhaps not entirely suited to the harsh realities of backwoods life. Cordelia noted that Vera spoke carefully, often pausing before answering questions, and had a habit of looking over her shoulder as though checking to see if she was being observed. These visits, however, became less frequent throughout 1921 and ceased entirely by early 1922. When Cordelia encountered Vera at a supply store in Corbin in March of that year, she noted that Vera appeared thinner, her complexion pale despite the approaching spring. When asked about her health, Vera responded that she had been keeping to the house more, and that Clayton preferred it that way. Cordelia recalled feeling uneasy about the response, but in a culture that valued privacy and non-interference in marital affairs, she said nothing further. The investigation into Vera's disappearance was, by all accounts, perfunctory. Sheriff Amos Breckenridge, age 61, had held his position for nearly 20 years through political connections rather than investigative prowess. The sheriff's report, filed on August 19, 1922, spans barely 2 pages. It documents Clayton's statement, notes that no signs of struggle were found in the house, and concludes with the speculation that Vera had likely run off, possibly with another man, though no evidence of any such relationship was ever presented or investigated. The search of the property, such as it was, lasted less than a day. Deputies walked the immediate grounds around the house, checked the barn and outbuildings, and questioned Clayton about any places his wife might have gone. They did not search the extensive forested areas of the property. They did not interview neighbors beyond a cursory conversation with Harlan Hendricks, Cordelia's husband. The root cellar was opened briefly, found empty except for preserved goods, and not examined further. Within 3 days, the case was effectively closed, classified as a voluntary disappearance. What was not included in the official report, but would surface years later, was a detail that Deputy Wade Cutler mentioned to his wife the evening after the search. According to her testimony given in 1963, Wade had returned home visibly troubled. When pressed about what bothered him, he mentioned that something about the house felt wrong. He described the interior as meticulously clean, but noted an unusual smell in the upper bedroom where Vera had supposedly last slept, a scent he couldn't quite identify but found unsettling. He also mentioned that when he'd asked to see the cellar, Clayton had hesitated, claiming the door was difficult to open. When they finally descended, Wade noted that the earthen floor appeared to have been recently disturbed in one corner, though Clayton explained he'd been moving preserved food stores. Wade Cutler never filed a supplementary report about these observations. He left the sheriff's department in 1924 and moved to Ohio, where he worked in a factory until his death in 1959. His wife, Loretta, only came forward with this information after reading a newspaper article about unsolved disappearances in Kentucky, published in April 1963. By that time, most of the principals involved were deceased, and the case remained officially closed. The story might have ended there, consigned to the growing list of unsolved rural disappearances that characterized the era, had it not been for the discovery made in the summer of 1966. The Stillwell property, abandoned since Clayton's death in 1944, had changed hands several times. A development company from Louisville purchased the land with the intention of logging the timber and possibly subdividing for vacation cabins. During the demolition of the old farmhouse, workers discovered a metal box wedged between the floor joists of the upper bedroom, hidden so thoroughly that it had gone unnoticed for decades. Inside the box were 2 items: a diary with entries spanning from April 1920 to August 1922, and a series of letters, some addressed but never sent, others in the form of unsent drafts. The foreman, a man named Eugene Harrell, initially intended to discard the items as debris. However, his assistant, a college student named Michael Davenport, working a summer job, recognized the potential historical significance and convinced Eugene to turn the materials over to the Kentucky Historical Society. The diary and letters were examined by Dr. Phyllis Moravec, a historian specializing in women's history in rural Appalachia. What she found in those pages was disturbing enough that she contacted state authorities, suggesting the case of Vera Stillwell's disappearance be reopened. The state police declined, citing the age of the case, the death of the primary suspect, and the difficulty of pursuing an investigation more than 4 decades old. The diary begins ordinarily enough. Early entries from 1920 document Vera's adjustment to rural life, her efforts to establish a home, and her hopes for the future. The tone is optimistic, occasionally noting challenges but maintaining an overall sense of purpose. An entry from May 1920 reads, "The house requires considerable work, but I believe we can make it comfortable." Clayton seems pleased with the property. The isolation takes some adjustment, but I find I rather enjoy the quiet after the noise of the city. By autumn of 1920, however, subtle changes begin to appear in the tone and content of the entries. Vera writes about Clayton's increasing preference for her to remain on the property, his discouragement of her visits to neighbors. An entry from November 1920 states, "C was displeased that I walked to the Hendricks place yesterday. He says the woods are dangerous and that I should not venture out alone. I attempted to explain that I know the path well now, but he became agitated. I have agreed not to go again without informing him first. The entries through early 1921 document a progressive isolation. Vera writes less frequently, and when she does, the language becomes more constrained, more careful. There are references to Clayton's moods, his periods of silence that could last for days, and what Vera describes as his episodes, where he would become convinced that someone was watching the property, leading him to patrol the perimeter for hours after dark. An entry from March 1921 is particularly revealing. I have not been to town in 6 weeks. C insists that everything we need can be obtained through his trips, which he makes alone. He says the journey tires me unnecessarily. I did not argue. It is easier not to argue. The house feels smaller each day, as though the walls are drawing closer. I know this is merely my imagination, but the feeling persists. Throughout 1921, the diary entries become increasingly sporadic. When Vera does write, she often mentions sounds she hears at night, footsteps on the stairs or in the hallway outside her room. She notes that Clayton has taken to locking her bedroom door from the outside for my safety, as he explains it, claiming that he has seen signs of trespassers on the property. Vera writes that she has seen no such signs, but does not challenge his assertion. An entry from September 1921 reads, "The lock was installed on my door yesterday. C demonstrated how it works, explaining that this is necessary until the trespassing issue is resolved. I am to knock if I need anything during the night." He keeps the key with him. I told myself that this arrangement is temporary, that it makes sense given his concerns. But lying here in the dark, listening to the sound of my own breathing, I cannot help but feel that I am no longer in my own home. I am somewhere else entirely. The final months of diary entries, from late 1921 through August 1922, paint a picture of psychological disintegration. Vera's handwriting becomes less controlled, the entries more fragmented. She writes about long stretches of time spent alone in her room, about meals delivered through the door, about conversations with Clayton that occur through the wooden barrier. She mentions that he has told her she is unwell and that isolation is necessary for her recovery, though she insists she feels no physical illness, only a growing sense of unreality. In February 1922, she writes, "I have lost track of the days. C removed the calendar from my room, saying that marking time was contributing to my agitation. He may be correct. Time seems to have lost its meaning. There is only the room, the walls, the sound of his footsteps in the hall. I tried the window last week. It has been nailed shut from the outside. He says this is for my protection, to prevent me from harming myself during one of my spells. I do not remember having any spells." The entries from June and July 1922 are brief, almost cryptic. Vera writes about dreams where she is running through the forest, about waking up confused as to whether she is awake or still dreaming. She mentions that Clayton has been spending more time in the root cellar, often descending with tools and emerging hours later. She can hear him working down there late into the night, though she does not know what he is doing. The final entry is dated August 15, 1922, 2 days before her disappearance was reported. "I have made a decision. I cannot continue this way. Tonight, when he brings the evening meal, I will tell him that I wish to leave, that I want to return to Lexington, to my family. I know he will not react well to this, but I see no alternative. Whatever consequences follow, they cannot be worse than this half-existence. I must try. I must at least try." There are no further diary entries. However, among the papers found in the box were 3 drafts of letters, all addressed to Vera's sister, Margaret, in Lexington. The letters were never sent, and given their content and the dates, it's likely Vera never had the opportunity to post them. The most complete draft, dated August 2, 1922, is particularly harrowing in its restraint. Dearest Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing to inform you of my situation, though I confess I do not know how to articulate it properly. Clayton is not well, though he would deny this vehemently if asked. His behavior over these past months has become increasingly erratic. He has confined me to my room for what he terms my own safety, claiming that I am suffering from a nervous condition that requires isolation. I assure you I am sound of mind, but I fear my protests only confirm his diagnosis in his eyes. I am alone for the vast majority of each day. My only interactions are brief exchanges with Clayton through the door. He brings meals, removes the chamber pot, and sometimes reads aloud from the Bible, selecting passages about obedience and the dangers of worldly temptation. When I ask to be allowed outside, even just to the porch, he becomes agitated and suggests that I am not yet ready, that the outside world would be too stimulating in my current state. I hesitate to write what I truly fear, Margaret. But if something should happen to me, if you should hear of my disappearance or my death, I want someone to know the truth. I am afraid of my husband, not because he has struck me, for he has not. But there is something in his eyes now, something that was not there when we married. A coldness, a certainty. He looks at me as though I am not a person, but rather a problem to be solved, a variable to be controlled. The house itself contributes to my unease. It is too quiet. The woods press in from all sides, and there is no one to call for help even if I could reach a window. The Hendricks live miles away, and I have not spoken to Cordelia in months. For all practical purposes, I have ceased to exist to the outside world. I do not know if I will be able to send this letter. Clayton monitors my possessions carefully, but I felt I must write it, must leave some record of my state of mind, my circumstances. If you receive this, please contact the authorities. If you do not receive it and you hear nothing from me for an extended period, I beg you to make inquiries. Do not simply accept whatever explanation Clayton provides. Your loving sister, Vera. Dr. Moravec's analysis of the documents submitted to state authorities along with her recommendation to reopen the case included several observations. She noted the classic pattern of domestic isolation and psychological abuse evident in the diary entries. She pointed out that Vera's increasingly sporadic writing corresponded with Clayton's escalating control measures. Most significantly, she highlighted the final diary entry and the unsent letters as evidence that Vera had been preparing to leave, suggesting that whatever happened on August 17, 1922, was likely connected to this decision. The state police, while acknowledging Dr. Moravec's concerns, maintained their position that the case could not be effectively investigated after so many years. The physical evidence was gone. The Stillwell house had been demolished. The property had been significantly altered by logging operations. Clayton Stillwell had been dead for over 2 decades, buried in a small cemetery outside Corbin. Even if they were to exhume his remains and somehow determine that a crime had occurred, there was no one left to hold accountable. However, Dr. Moravec did not abandon her investigation. Over the following 3 years, she conducted extensive research into the Stillwell case, interviewing anyone still living who had known the couple or had any connection to the events of 1922. What she uncovered painted a more complete and more troubling picture. One of her most significant interviews was with Reverend Samuel Pritchard, who in 1922 had been a young minister at the Baptist Church in Corbin. In 1967, at the age of 73, Reverend Pritchard was retired and living in Bowling Green. He remembered Clayton Stillwell vividly, describing him as a man who attended services irregularly, but who, when present, displayed an intensity that made others uncomfortable. According to Pritchard, Clayton had approached him in July 1922, requesting a private conversation about what he termed a spiritual matter. During this meeting, Clayton expressed concern about his wife's mental state, claiming she had become increasingly irrational and was speaking of leaving him to return to her family. He asked the Reverend if there were scriptural justifications for restricting a wife's movements, if such restriction was deemed necessary for her spiritual and physical well-being. Pritchard recalled being deeply uneasy with the conversation. He attempted to counsel Clayton about the importance of patience and understanding in marriage, and suggested that if Vera was indeed unwell, she should be examined by a physician. Clayton became agitated at this suggestion, stating that physicians were unnecessary and possibly harmful, that they would only encourage Vera's delusions about leaving. The conversation ended tensely, with Clayton departing abruptly. Pritchard admitted that he should have followed up on this conversation, perhaps reaching out to Vera directly or alerting some authority. However, in the cultural context of rural Kentucky in 1922, a husband's authority over his wife was largely unquestioned, and a minister's role was to counsel, not intervene. When news of Vera's disappearance reached him a month later, Pritchard experienced significant guilt, wondering if his inaction had contributed to whatever fate had befallen her. This guilt, he told Dr. Moravec, had haunted him for decades. Another crucial interview was with Harlan Hendricks, Jr., son of Harlan and Cordelia Hendricks. In 1922, he had been 17 years old, working on his family's small farm. He remembered the Stillwells, particularly an incident from the spring of 1922 that he had never reported to authorities at the time. He had been hunting turkey in the woods between the Hendricks and Stillwell properties when he heard what sounded like a woman's voice calling for help. The sound came from the direction of the Stillwell house, though it was distant, and he couldn't be certain of its source. He had stopped, listening intently, and heard it again, a cry that seemed to come from inside the house. Concerned, he had approached the edge of the cleared land surrounding the Stillwell property, staying within the tree line. He observed Clayton standing on the front porch, appearing to have heard the same sound. But rather than showing concern, Clayton seemed angry. He entered the house, and Harlan Jr. heard raised voices, though he couldn't make out the words. After several minutes, silence returned. Harlan Jr., uncertain of what he had witnessed, and afraid of being caught trespassing near another man's property, quietly withdrew and said nothing about the incident to his parents or anyone else. "I have thought about that day many times over the years," he told Dr. Moravec in 1968. "I convinced myself at the time that I had misheard, that perhaps it was an animal, or that the Stillwells were simply having a domestic dispute. But I heard her voice again in my mind when the news came that she had disappeared. I should have said something then. I should have told the sheriff. But I was young, and my father always taught me that you don't interfere in another man's household. By the time I was old enough to realize that some situations demand interference, it was too late. She was already gone." Dr. Moravec also uncovered information about Clayton Stillwell's background that had not been widely known in 1922. Military records showed that he had served in France during 1918, but his discharge papers indicated that he had spent the final months of his service in a military hospital, treated for what was termed shell shock, what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. His medical file, which Dr. Moravec obtained through a Freedom of Information request, documented periods of paranoia, violent nightmares, and an incident where he had locked himself in a storage room for 2 days, convinced that he was still under artillery bombardment. The military physicians had recommended that Clayton receive continued psychiatric care after his discharge, but there was no evidence that he had ever sought such treatment. Instead, he had returned to Kentucky, purchased the isolated property, and married Vera within 2 years. Dr. Moravec theorized that the isolation of the Stillwell property, far from being incidental, was specifically chosen by Clayton as a way to manage his psychological state. The control he exerted over Vera may have been, in his disturbed thinking, a way of controlling what he perceived as the chaotic threats of the outside world. The final piece of Dr. Moravec's investigation involved the Stillwell property itself. Though the house had been demolished, she obtained permission from the current landowners to bring in a team of forensic archaeologists in the summer of 1969. The goal was to locate and excavate the site of the old root cellar, which had been filled in during the demolition, but which might still yield physical evidence. The excavation took 3 weeks. The team carefully removed layers of earth and debris, eventually uncovering the stone foundation of the cellar. The space was approximately 12 feet by 15 feet with earthen floor and walls. Wooden shelving had once lined the walls, though only rotted remnants remained. The team systematically screened all the soil removed from the cellar, searching for any artifacts or evidence. What they found was troubling, though not conclusive. In the northeast corner of the cellar floor, at a depth of approximately 3 feet, they uncovered fragments of fabric that appeared to be consistent with a woman's dress from the 1920s era. Chemical analysis of the surrounding soil showed elevated levels of decomposition markers, though the passage of nearly 50 years made it impossible to determine definitively whether these markers indicated human remains or simply the presence of organic material that had decomposed naturally over time. More significantly, they found evidence that a section of the cellar floor had been disturbed and recompacted at some point after the cellar's original construction. The soil in this area showed clear stratification differences from the surrounding earth. It was in this disturbed section that the fabric fragments were discovered. The archaeological team's report concluded that it was highly probable that something had been buried in the northeast corner of the cellar floor, and that this burial occurred sometime after the cellar's construction. However, given the contamination of the site from decades of exposure to the elements after the house's demolition and the absence of any skeletal remains, they could not definitively state what had been buried or when. Dr. Moravec's final report, submitted to the Kentucky State Police in November 1969, synthesized all of her findings. She presented a timeline of events, supported by documentary evidence and witness testimony, that suggested the following narrative. Vera Stilwell, increasingly isolated and controlled by her psychologically disturbed husband, made the decision in August 1922 to leave. She communicated this intention to Clayton either on August 15th or 16th. Clayton, whose mental state had been deteriorating and who viewed Vera's presence as essential to his ability to maintain his own psychological equilibrium, reacted violently to this threat of abandonment. In the hours between the evening of August 16th and the morning of August 17th, Clayton killed Vera, most likely in the upper bedroom. He then transported her body to the root cellar and buried it beneath the earthen floor. He waited approximately 12 hours before reporting her disappearance, using this time to ensure that the burial site was secure and that the house showed no signs of struggle. When the sheriff and deputies arrived, Clayton performed the role of confused husband, and the cursory investigation, combined with prevailing attitudes about women who ran off, resulted in the case being quickly closed. Clayton lived alone on the property for another 22 years, dying in 1944 at the age of 59. According to his death certificate, he died of heart failure, alone in the house. A neighbor who discovered his body 3 days later reported that the house was in a state of severe neglect, with evidence that Clayton had been living primarily in the kitchen and one downstairs room. The upper floor had apparently not been occupied in years, the stairs blocked by furniture. Dr. Moravec's report concluded with a statement that has become frequently quoted in discussions of cold cases and historic crimes. The evidence, while circumstantial and incomplete due to the passage of time, strongly suggests that Vera Stilwell died at the hands of her husband and was buried on the property. The failure of authorities in 1922 to conduct a thorough investigation, combined with societal attitudes that granted husbands unchallenged authority over their wives, resulted in a situation where Clayton Stilwell was effectively allowed to commit murder and face no consequences. This case stands as a stark reminder of the ways in which isolation, both physical and social, can enable abuse and violence, and of the importance of questioning narratives that seem too convenient, too easily explained. The state police reviewed Dr. Moravec's report and acknowledged the validity of her research. However, they maintained that, without definitive physical evidence and with all principals deceased, the case would remain officially unsolved. No charges would ever be filed. No trial would ever be held. The mystery of Vera Stilwell's disappearance would remain, legally speaking, a mystery. Dr. Moravec's work, however, did have lasting impact. Her research was published as an article in the Journal of Appalachian Studies in 1971, and subsequently formed the basis for a chapter in her 1974 book, Silenced Voices, Women's Lives in Rural Appalachia, 1890-1930. The Stilwell case became a case study in discussions about domestic violence, the importance of thorough investigation of missing persons cases, and the ways that isolation can be weaponized by abusers. In the years since Dr. Moravec's investigation, a few additional pieces of information have emerged. A letter discovered in 2003 among the papers of Dr. Vincent Carmichael, who practiced medicine in Corbin from 1915 to 1945, revealed that Clayton had consulted him in July 1922 about procuring sedatives. According to Dr. Carmichael's notes, Clayton claimed the medication was for himself, to help with insomnia. However, the doctor noted that Clayton asked very specific questions about dosage and the effects of the medication, questions that seemed to go beyond mere concern about sleep troubles. Dr. Carmichael had refused to prescribe anything stronger than mild sleep aids, a decision he noted made Clayton visibly upset. There is also a brief mention of the Stilwell case in the personal diary of Martha Keene, a school teacher in Corbin in the 1920s. In an entry from September 1922, she wrote, "There is talk among the women at church about Mrs. Stilwell's disappearance. The official story is that she left her husband, but many of us find this difficult to credit. I met Vera Stilwell only twice, but she did not strike me as a woman who would abandon her life so completely, leaving behind all her possessions. There is something else at work here, I am certain of it, but what can be done? The sheriff has closed the case, and Clayton Stilwell continues to live on that isolated property. I find myself hoping that if there is any justice in this world, it will find him eventually. If there was any justice, it remains unclear whether it ever found Clayton Stilwell. He lived out his remaining years alone, gradually becoming a figure of vague unease in the community. Neighbors reported seeing lights in his windows late at night, heard sounds coming from the property, tools being used at odd hours. Some claimed to hear a woman's voice carried on the wind from the direction of the Stilwell land, though this was generally attributed to imagination or the peculiar acoustics of the forested hills. One incident, recorded in a sheriff's report from 1936, involved a traveling salesman who stopped at the Stilwell property seeking shelter during a storm. The salesman later reported to authorities that Clayton had become extremely agitated when asked if his wife was home, insisting that the salesman leave immediately despite the dangerous weather. The salesman, rattled by Clayton's behavior, departed and spent the night in his vehicle several miles down the road. He described Clayton as appearing much older than his 51 years, with a haunted quality that the salesman found deeply disturbing. The Stilwell property changed hands multiple times after Clayton's death. Each owner stayed only briefly before selling, citing various practical reasons: the isolation, the difficulty of maintaining such a large property, poor soil quality for farming. But there were also whispered comments about an atmosphere of sadness that permeated the land, a sense that something terrible had happened there and left an indelible mark. When the house was finally demolished in 1966, workers reported that the interior, particularly the upper bedroom, had an unusual quality to the walls. Scratch marks were found on the inside of the door, deep gouges in the wood that had been painted over multiple times. The window in that room had indeed been nailed shut from the outside, the nails rusted, but still firmly in place after more than 4 decades. One of the demolition workers, in an interview given to a local newspaper in 1967, stated that he felt uncomfortable throughout the entire job. "That house didn't want to come down," he said. "Every board we pulled, every wall we knocked in, it felt like we were disturbing something. When we got to that upstairs bedroom, the one that had been locked up, the air was different. Stale, but more than that. Like the room had been holding its breath for years, and finally let it out when we broke through." The metal box containing Vera's diary and letters, hidden between the floor joists, had been placed there deliberately and with some care. The location suggested that Vera had found a loose board and created a hiding place, perhaps hoping that someday someone would find her words and understand what had happened to her. The irony that this discovery came 44 years too late, long after anyone could be held accountable, is not lost on those who have studied the case. In recent years, the Stillwell case has gained renewed attention through true crime podcasts and online communities dedicated to cold cases. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects: the isolation, the psychological abuse, the failure of the investigation, the peculiar details that suggest something deeply wrong occurred. Some focus on Dr. Moravec's work as an example of dedicated historical research uncovering hidden truths. Others use the case to discuss how domestic violence operates, particularly in situations where physical isolation is combined with psychological manipulation. The land where the Stillwell house once stood is now part of a larger tract of commercial forest. The old road that led to the property is barely discernible, overgrown with vegetation. The root cellar site, once excavated and examined, was filled in again and allowed to return to nature. There is no marker, no indication that anything of significance occurred in this particular patch of Kentucky wilderness. But those who know the story sometimes visit the area, standing in the forest among the oak and pine trees, listening to the wind move through the branches. They think about Vera Stillwell, a woman whose life ended alone, whose death went unpunished, whose story nearly disappeared into silence. They think about how many other Veras there might have been and might still be, in isolated places where no one is watching, where no one intervenes, where disappearances can be explained away with convenient narratives. The haunting aspect of the Stillwell case is not the presence of any supernatural element, but rather the very human horror of it. A woman trapped by circumstance and the cultural norms of her time, unable to escape a situation that grew progressively more dangerous. A community that, whether through indifference or adherence to beliefs about non-interference in domestic matters, failed to recognize or respond to warning signs. An investigation so cursory that it essentially amounted to accepting a suspect's story without question. And ultimately, a perpetrator who lived out his life without ever facing legal consequences for what all available evidence suggests was murder. There is a photograph of Vera Stillwell, one of only 2 known to exist, that appears in Dr. Moravec's book. It was taken shortly before her marriage to Clayton and shows a young woman with dark hair and serious eyes standing in front of a building in Lexington. She is not smiling, but her expression is composed, dignified. There is nothing in the photograph to suggest the fate that awaited her, nothing to indicate that within 2 years she would be living in isolation, and within another 2 years she would be gone entirely. Looking at that photograph, knowing what we now know about her final years, is a disquieting experience. The woman in the image had hopes, plans, a future she expected to live. That future was taken from her in the backwoods of Kentucky, in a house where no one could hear her, by a man who believed he had the right to control every aspect of her existence, even unto death. The most terrifying aspect of the mystery is not what remains unknown, but what we do know. We know that Vera wrote of her fear. We know that she tried to reach out, to send letters, to leave a record. We know that she recognized her danger and tried to leave. And we know that she disappeared, and that the only person who could have answered what happened to her simply said she had gone, and for 22 years lived alone in that house with whatever he had done. There will be no trial for Clayton Stillwell. There will be no justice in any conventional sense. The Kentucky State Police will not reopen the case. Vera Stillwell will remain in official records a missing person. Her fate officially unknown, despite all evidence to the contrary. This is the reality of the case, a mystery that is no mystery at all, but rather a crime where the truth is apparent yet unprovable, where everyone knows what happened, but no one will ever be held to account. Perhaps the only justice, such as it is, lies in the fact that Vera's words survived. The diary and letters she hid so carefully were eventually found. Her voice, which Clayton sought to silence, still speaks to us across the decades. We know her fear. We understand her situation. We recognize the tragedy of what happened to her. In a world where so many victims vanish completely, erased from memory and history, at least Vera Stillwell left a record. At least we know she existed, that she mattered, that her disappearance was not just a woman running off, but something far darker. The Kentucky forest grows dense around the site where she likely died. The seasons turn, the years pass, and the land itself seems indifferent to human tragedy. But somewhere in archives and libraries, in academic journals and historical records, Vera Stillwell's story persists. It serves as a reminder of how easily people can vanish when they are isolated, how thoroughly the powerful can control the powerless, and how often justice fails those who need it most. When we ask why no one was ever held accountable for what happened in the backwoods of Kentucky in 1922, the answer is both simple and complex. No one was held accountable because the systems designed to ensure accountability failed at every level. The investigation was insufficient. The cultural attitudes of the time favored the word of a husband over the safety of a wife. The physical isolation of the crime scene aided the perpetrator and hindered any real inquiry, and by the time anyone truly looked deeply into what had happened, too much time had passed, too many witnesses had died, and the primary suspect had been dead for more than 20 years. This is the terror at the heart of the case, not the ghost story that some have tried to make of it, not any supernatural element, but the cold reality that a man could do what Clayton Stillwell almost certainly did, and live out the rest of his life without ever facing consequences. That is the mystery that disturbs most deeply, not the question of what happened to Vera Stillwell, for we can reasonably deduce what happened, but why nothing was done about it, why the system designed to protect her failed so completely, and why this failure was, in its time and place, utterly unremarkable. The house is gone now. The witnesses are gone. The perpetrator is gone. Only the land remains and the records and the questions that linger. In the end, the most terrifying mysteries are often not those that cannot be solved, but those that can be solved yet remain officially unresolved because the machinery of justice arrived too late, moved too slowly, or never truly engaged at all.